Move. Move out of my way, old woman. Can't you see I'm busy? Adana's voice cut through the morning air at the river like a knife through soft flesh. The market day had just begun, and women gathered to fetch water before the sun climbed too high. Traders balanced baskets on their heads, children played near the bank, and the air smelled of wet earth and fresh cassava bread from nearby stalls. But Adana pushed through them all with the force of someone who believed the world owed her passage. Her wrapper was finest indigo, her jewelry heavy and loud. Beauty and strength had always cleared her path before. The frail elderly stranger hadn't moved fast enough. Perhaps she was steadying herself. Perhaps she was simply old and slow. It didn't matter to Adana. You waste everyone's time, she spat. Your useless generation should stay home where you belong. Then, without warning, without provocation beyond a few seconds' delay, Adana's hand flew across the old woman's face. The slap echoed across the water like thunder announcing rain. The old woman stumbled but did not fall. Water splashed against the riverbank with unnatural force, as if the river itself had flinched. But the stranger did not cry. Did not curse. Did not even raise her voice. She steadied herself slowly and murmured words too soft for anyone to hear clearly. Then the river went still. Completely, impossibly still. The silence came first. Not the comfortable quiet of morning or the peaceful hush of evening. This was the kind of silence that presses against eardrums and makes hearts beat louder in compensation. The birds stopped calling mid-song. Traders froze mid-bargain, money still clutched in their hands. Even the children playing nearby went quiet without being told, their small bodies instinctively pressing closer to their mothers. The entire riverbank felt watched. Not by human eyes, but by something older, something patient, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. Adana stood tall, chin lifted, and laughed. A sharp, bright sound meant to shatter whatever strange tension had settled over the water. See? Nothing happened. Just an old woman being dramatic. She adjusted her wrapper with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone saw she was unbothered, unafraid, untouched by whatever foolish superstition had gripped the crowd. But nobody laughed with her. Not one voice joined hers. Not one smile appeared. Instead, people stepped back slightly, creating space around her as though she carried something contagious. An old woman standing near the trader's stall, her face lined with decades of wisdom, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "This place remembers." The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't disperse. By the time Adana reached the edge of the market, gossip had already spread like fire through dry grass. Voices carried her name from stall to stall, compound to compound. You heard what she did at the river? Slapped an elder. Without reason. In front of everyone. Adana had always been known throughout the village. But known was not the same as respected. Beauty had opened doors, yes. Strength had cleared paths, certainly. But behind those doors, people whispered. Along those paths, people shook their heads. She had humiliated a farmer's wife for selling at the wrong price. She had mocked a young mother whose child cried too loudly. She had refused to greet elders properly, claiming tradition was chains for the weak. Traders spoke of her cruelty. Elders avoided correcting her, fearing public embarrassment. Even young men who once admired her beauty now spoke of her coldness, her sharp tongue, her belief that kindness was weakness. But this was different. Under the baobab tree where village elders gathered to discuss important matters, 5 old men sat in unusual silence. One finally spoke, voice heavy. She struck an elder at the sacred river. Without provocation. Without shame. Another nodded slowly. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. A third elder poured libation onto the ground. The water soaked into the earth like a warning being delivered to forces beyond human sight. This offense, they agreed, had crossed an unseen line that even Adana's beauty and pride could not protect her from. Adana's father waited for her inside their compound, standing with the rigid posture of a man preparing for battle. Her mother sat on a low stool, hands folded tightly, eyes red from tears already shed. "What have you done?" her father asked quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that comes before storms. Adana set down her water pot with deliberate carelessness. "I corrected an old woman who couldn't move fast enough. Nothing more." Her mother's voice trembled. "That was no ordinary place, Adana. The river is not just water. Our ancestors." Adana laughed, cutting her off. "Ancestors? Stories for frightened children. I live in the real world, not in superstitions whispered by old women who fear their own shadows." Her father stepped closer, urgency replacing anger. "The river has rules, child. Sacred rules. Elders at the water are protected. The spirits." "Enough," Adana snapped. "I will not live in fear of invisible things. I will not bow to traditions that exist only to keep people small and obedient." She pushed past them both, her jewelry jangling like defiant bells, and disappeared into her room. That night, after Adana had fallen asleep, her father stood alone in the compound. He poured libation carefully, whispering prayers in the old language, asking forgiveness for a daughter who refused to ask it herself. The water soaked into the earth. The earth did not answer. But somewhere in the distance, the river moved in the darkness. The dream came that night like water seeping through cracks too small to see. Adana stood in the river, though she didn't remember walking there. The water was shallow, barely covering her ankles, warm as blood. The sun hung impossibly large in a sky too bright to look at directly. She tried to move forward but her feet wouldn't obey. The water around her ankles began to rise slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice. Ankle to shin. Shin to knee. Knee to thigh. "Move," she commanded her legs. "Move." But her body had become stone. The old woman's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, calm as morning prayer. "You struck without thinking. Now the river thinks for you." The water climbed higher. Chest. Shoulders. Chin. Adana tried to scream but water filled her mouth before sound could escape. She woke gasping, clawing at her throat, fighting blankets that had tangled around her like river weeds. Sweat soaked her wrapper. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape a trap. "Just a dream," she whispered to the darkness. "Just a dream." But when she stood, her feet felt heavy. Unnaturally heavy. As though the water from her dream had followed her into waking, clinging to her ankles like invisible weights. She shook her legs, stretched, walked around her room. The feeling didn't fade. But she told herself it was nothing. Fatigue. Poor sleep. Nothing more. By afternoon, the tightening had become undeniable. Adana sat on her mat examining her ankles. The skin looked stretched, somehow. Not swollen exactly, but changed. Foreign. As though it belonged to someone else's body and had been grafted onto hers during the night. She pressed her fingers against the flesh. It felt dense, resistant, like pressing clay that had begun to harden but hadn't fully set. Her mother entered carrying soup and saw Adana quickly pull cloth over her legs. "What's wrong with your feet?" "Nothing," Adana snapped. "I'm tired. That's all." But her mother's eyes had already seen. Fear flickered across her face before she could hide it. "You need to see the herbalist." "I need rest." "Nothing more." Her mother left the soup and departed without another word, but Adana heard her outside talking urgently with her father. Their voices carried through the thin walls. Worried. Frightened. Adana tried to stand and gasped. The tightness had sharpened into pain. Not unbearable, not yet. But present. Real. Growing. She wrapped her ankles in extra cloth, hiding the strangeness from view. Dismissing it as temporary. Refusing to connect it to the river, to the slap, to the old woman's whispered words. But as the sun set and shadows lengthened across her room, the pain sharpened like thorns pushing through skin from the inside out. Adana returned to the market the next morning with her head held high and her jewelry catching sunlight like declarations of war. If people wanted to stare, let them stare. She would show them she feared nothing. But the market had changed overnight. Or perhaps she had changed, and the market simply reflected what she'd become. People stared openly now, no longer bothering to whisper behind their hands. Children pointed until their mothers pulled them away sharply. A trader she'd known for years refused to sell to her, turning away as though Adana had become invisible. At the fabric stall, two women spoke just loud enough for her to hear, "The river has taken her name." "What does that mean?" the younger one asked. "It means she belongs to something else now. Not to herself anymore." Adana spun toward them. "Say that again to my face." But they had already melted into the crowd. She moved toward the water seller's stand and caught her reflection in a large calabash filled with drinking water. For a moment, just a moment, the reflection looked wrong. Distorted. As though the water itself refused to show her clearly. She blinked and the reflection steadied. But the wrongness lingered like a taste that wouldn't wash away. All around her, the market continued its business. But she moved through it now like a ghost, noticed but not welcomed, seen but not acknowledged, present but somehow already absent. The swelling crept upward. By the third day, it had climbed past her ankles, past her calves, settling into her knees like unwanted guests who'd decided to stay forever. Walking became difficult. Not impossible, but each step required thought, effort, concentration. Her legs moved as though the air around them had thickened into something she had to push through. When villagers showed concern, she insulted them viciously. When her mother brought remedies, she threw them across the compound. When her father suggested prayer, she laughed until the laughter turned into something that sounded like crying but wasn't, couldn't be, because Adana had never cried. During the day she walked through the market forcing herself to move normally, to show strength, to demonstrate that whatever was happening hadn't conquered her will. But at night, alone in her room, she bit cloth to keep from screaming. The pain had grown teeth. It bit deeper each night, gnawing at bones that had never known such betrayal. Still, she told no one. Asked for nothing. Admitted to nothing. Pride had become her armor, the only thing standing between her and complete collapse. If she let the armor fall, if she acknowledged weakness, then the strange tightness spreading through her body would win. And Adana had never lost to anything. But her voice, that sharp instrument she'd always wielded like a weapon, began to crack unnaturally. Words came out fractured, broken, as though even speech was being taken from her piece by piece. Adana's parents brought her to the herbalist under cover of darkness, bribing her with promises and threats until she finally agreed to go. They couldn't carry her to town in daylight where everyone would see, where gossip would spread faster than medicine could heal. The herbalist's compound smelled of dried leaves and old smoke. He sat waiting for them as though he'd known they would come, as though their arrival had been written in stars he'd read days ago. He examined Adana without touching her. His eyes moved over her body slowly, cataloging what others couldn't see. Then he cast cowries onto a goatskin mat, watching how they fell, reading patterns invisible to untrained eyes. The shell settled. He went completely silent. Adana's mother broke first. "What is it? What do you see?" The herbalist gathered his cowries carefully. "She struck the river guardian," he said quietly. "Not just an elder. Not just an old woman. The one who tests character at sacred waters." "That's impossible," Adana said, but her voice had lost its strength. The herbalist looked at her with something that might have been pity. "The river doesn't lie. Neither do these shells. You raised your hand against a spirit in human form." He stood, refusing the money Adana's father tried to give him. "This is not illness. Medicine cannot cure what pride created." "Then what can?" her mother begged. The herbalist walked to his doorway, pausing in the threshold. Only what broke it can repair it. Only she knows the answer. 10. The herbalist's words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Adana's parents leaned forward, desperate for instructions, for rituals, for any path that didn't require their daughter's surrender. Tell us what to do, her father said. Any sacrifice. Any offering. We'll bring whatever the spirits demand. The herbalist shook his head slowly. There is no forced cure. No ritual works without surrender. No offering substitutes for genuine change. He turned to Adana directly. You must go to the river. You must find the elder. You must kneel without excuses and apologize without conditions. Only humility unlocks healing. Only truth reverses curses. Adana shot to her feet, pain making her movement jerky and desperate. You want me to beg? To grovel before that old liar? She's no liar, the herbalist said calmly. She's a mirror. She reflects what's already there. You struck her because you saw weakness. But weakness was never hers. I won't do it, Adana declared, her voice cracking mid-sentence. I won't humble myself before someone who means nothing. I'd rather die? The herbalist finished quietly. That's where this path leads if you don't change direction. Adana's mother began to cry. The herbalist touched her shoulder gently. Time is not on her side. The river is patient, but patience is not the same as mercy. The body tells truth faster than the heart learns it. He walked them to the compound entrance. When the pain becomes greater than the pride, he said to Adana, you'll find your way. Most do. Some don't. That choice belongs to you alone. By the 7th day, Adana's skin had begun to harden visibly. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in patches that spread like shadows creeping across sunlit ground. Her arms moved stiffly. Her neck turned with effort. Walking required concentration and courage because each step sent sharp pains shooting up legs that no longer felt entirely like hers. For the first time in her life, she bent. Not by choice, but because her body demanded it. Her spine curved slightly forward as though invisible hands pressed down on her shoulders, forcing her into a posture of permanent humility her pride had never allowed. In the market, laughter had stopped. Fear replaced mockery. People stepped away when she approached, not from disgust but from genuine terror. Someone standing near the cloth merchant's stall whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. She's becoming something else. Another voice answered, the river doesn't forgive easily. It teaches. Adana tried to respond, to defend herself, to unleash the sharp words that had always been her weapon. But her voice came out broken, barely human, more like whine through hollow reeds than human speech. Children who once merely avoided her now ran when they saw her coming. Traders pulled down their shutters. Even dogs that used to bark at everything went silent in her presence. She had wanted to be unforgettable. Now she was. But as a warning, not a triumph. As a lesson others would tell their children. As proof that some rules existed for reasons deeper than tradition. Adana locked herself inside her room, refusing to see anyone, refusing to speak to anyone, refusing to acknowledge the reality crawling up her body like vines claiming an abandoned house. I would rather die, she screamed to the empty room. I would rather die than beg. But death, it seemed, was not interested. The curse wasn't killing her. It was transforming her. Slowly. Methodically. Making her into something that would live but would never again move freely through the world as she once had. Her parents heard everything through the thin walls. They heard her rage. They heard her pain. They heard her crying that wasn't crying because Adana insisted she didn't cry. And they heard something else. In the quietest hours before dawn, they heard her begging. Not to them. Not to the spirits. But to her own body. Please, she whispered to her hardening limbs. Please stop. Please work. Please move like you used to. The body didn't answer. It continued its slow betrayal, turning against her will with the patience of water wearing down stone. Outside, her mother pressed her hands against the door, tears streaming silently. Inside, her father knelt in the compound, pouring more libation, whispering more prayers, asking for mercy that didn't seem to be coming. But the spirits, if they heard, gave no sign. The transformation continued uninterrupted, unstoppable, obeying laws older than any living person could remember. Adana screamed into cloth so the village wouldn't hear. But the village already knew. The river had told them everything. On the 10th morning, Adana's mother broke. She walked to the village square alone, her wrapper dusty from the road, her face marked by sleepless nights. She knelt publicly before the gathered elders, her knees hitting the ground hard enough to send up small clouds of dust. We failed, she said to the earth, to the sky, to anyone who would listen. We raised a daughter without humility. We let beauty excuse cruelty. We allowed strength to become tyranny. Her husband appeared minutes later, standing beside her with shoulders bent under invisible weight. I ask forgiveness, he said, his voice carrying across the market. For our daughter. For ourselves. For the pride we let grow unchecked in our home. The villagers watched in silence. Some felt pity. Some felt vindication. All felt the weight of witnessing a family's complete unraveling. Inside her locked room, Adana heard everything. The compound walls were thin. Sound traveled easily. She heard her mother's tears. Her father's broken voice. The silence of the crowd that should have been judgment but felt worse, felt like being erased while still breathing. Her parents' public shame became the mirror her private pain couldn't provide. For the first time, she saw herself clearly not through her own eyes but through the devastation she'd caused people who had loved her without condition, without reservation, despite everything. The shame that broke her wasn't about her body. It was about theirs. About knees that shouldn't have touched dust. About voices that shouldn't have trembled. Finally, she whispered to the empty room, I will go. Adana left before dawn, before the village woke, before anyone could witness her final surrender. Her body moved slowly, painfully, each step a negotiation between will and flesh that barely obeyed. The path to the river stretched longer than she remembered. Forest pressed close on both sides, trees seeming to lean inward, watching her struggle. Thorns caught her wrapper, tearing expensive cloth she'd once been so proud of. Her feet, wrapped in cloth to hide their strangeness, bled inside the fabric. Each step left dark spots on the dusty path. She didn't stop. Didn't complain. Didn't allow herself rest. The forest seemed alive with awareness. Birds called to each other as she passed, their songs carrying news of her journey to listeners she couldn't see. Wind moved through leaves with a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. She fell twice. Both times she forced herself back up without crying out. Pride still lived somewhere inside her, but it had changed form. Now it was the pride of finishing what she'd started, of walking toward humility rather than running from it. By the time the river came into view, the sun had climbed halfway to noon. Her legs trembled. Sweat soaked her wrapper. Pain had become so constant it no longer felt like pain, just her natural state, the truth of her body. She reached the riverbank and saw what she'd come to find. The old woman waited by the water, sitting exactly where she'd stood days ago when Adana's hand had struck her face. The elder looked unchanged. Unshaken. As though 10 days had passed in a moment, or perhaps hadn't passed at all. She sat on a smooth stone, her back straight, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the water's surface. She didn't look up when Adana approached. Didn't acknowledge her presence. Simply continued watching the river as though reading messages written in the current. Adana tried to walk closer but her legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the riverbank, hands hitting mud, breath coming in ragged gasps. I'm sorry, she whispered. The words came out broken, fragmented, but real. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The repetition wasn't strategy. It was all she could manage. All that remained when pride finally shattered completely. I was wrong, she gasped between breaths. I was cruel. I was arrogant. I thought I was above everyone. Above rules. Above consequences. Above you. She lifted her head, forcing herself to meet the elder's eyes. I'm not above anything. I see that now. Please. Please forgive me. Please undo what I've caused. The elder finally turned. Her face showed no anger. No satisfaction. Just ancient patience and the kind of knowledge that comes from watching many seasons change. But she didn't speak forgiveness. Not yet. She simply looked at Adana with eyes that had seen this story play out many times before, in many villages, with many proud daughters who learned too late that respect isn't a suggestion. The elder stood slowly, moving with the careful grace of someone whose body has learned to carry centuries of wisdom without complaint. She walked to the water's edge and dipped her fingers in the current. I am not here for revenge, she said, her voice carrying the same soft strength it had held when Adana struck her. I am here for balance. Balance, she continued, exists everywhere. You pushed the world out of balance when you struck an elder at sacred water without cause. The river responded. Not from anger. From necessity. Adana knelt on the bank, tears mixing with mud, her hardened skin catching sunlight like stone. What must I do? The elder turned to face her fully. Healing comes. But pride cannot return with it. Your strength must serve others, not your own elevation. Your beauty, if it returns, must remind you of fragility, not superiority. Your voice must speak kindness before it speaks at all. Adana nodded, understanding these weren't conditions to negotiate. They were the terms of existence in a world where balance mattered more than individual will. Can you accept these limits? The elder asked. Can you live knowing your actions created them? Yes, Adana whispered. Yes. Please. I'll do anything. Anything is too large a promise, the elder said gently. Simply do what's required each day. Treat elders with respect. Speak to the weak with kindness. Remember that water, like pride, can drown when it rises too high. She touched the river once. The water rippled outward in perfect circles, each ring expanding until they disappeared beyond sight. That night, the village learned the truth they'd suspected but never confirmed. The elder was no ordinary woman. She was the river guardian, the one who walked among people wearing different faces in different seasons, testing character the way fire tests metal. She appeared when pride grew dangerous. When arrogance threatened the balance communities needed to survive. When someone needed to be reminded that individual strength meant nothing without collective respect. The river's silence during Adana's attack hadn't been absence. It had been judgment. Water remembers everything. Water witnesses all. And water, when disrespected, responds with the patience of elements that have seen civilizations rise and fall like ripples on its surface. Children who had been too young to understand now gathered around evening fires listening to elders explain. Parents used Adana's story to teach lessons about humility. Traders reminded customers that kindness costs nothing but its absence costs everything. Adana's healing began that night. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But subtly, the way dawn comes, slowly enough that you don't notice until darkness has already lifted. The hardness in her skin softened slightly. The tightness in her joints eased fractionally. Her voice, when she tried to speak, came out clearer than it had in days. But the healing was measured, controlled, teaching her that recovery, like respect, couldn't be rushed or demanded. It came at the river's pace, not hers. And that, the elders said, was exactly the lesson she needed most. The healing took months. Slow as tree growth. Patient as seasonal change. But Adana's behavior changed faster than her body. That transformation was immediate, total, undeniable. She who had walked through the market like a conqueror now moved like a servant. She greeted elders first. She helped traders lift heavy loads. She spoke softly when she spoke at all. Children who had once hidden now approached her cautiously. She showed them gentleness they'd never seen from her before. Traders who had refused her business began to soften, watching for signs that this change was real, was lasting, was more than performance. Her parents watched with cautious hope. Her mother whispered prayers of gratitude each morning. Her father's shoulders gradually straightened as pride slowly returned, this time in his daughter's humility rather than her arrogance. One market day, months after the river incident, the elder passed through the village. She walked slowly between stalls, observing, witnessing, testing in ways only she could see. Adana, now moving freely again though still marked by the memory of hardness in her joints, saw the elder and fell to her knees immediately. Not from fear. From respect that had become instinct. The elder paused. Touched Adana's head gently. "You have learned," she said simply. Then she continued walking, her form gradually fading into the crowd until no one could say precisely when she'd disappeared or if she'd truly been there at all. The village treated Adana with cautious respect now. Not warmth exactly, not yet. But acknowledgement. She had become a living warning, a breathing reminder that arrogance calls consequences, that pride delays mercy, that humility restores what violence breaks. And sometimes, late at night, Adana returned to the river alone. She would kneel at the water's edge and whisper gratitude to forces that had broken her in order to remake her into someone who could finally, truly, live in balance with the world that held her. Final moral. Disrespect calls consequences. Pride delays mercy. Humility restores balance.